All right. Welcome all to this public and co-hosted event by the Nordic Alliance for Communication and Management, or NORA for short, and the EACD. My name is Alexander Buhmann. I'm Associate Professor at the Norwegian Business School and also Director of NORA. And I have the great pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar on trust and public debate in the age of social media and fake news. With us today, we have Katrina Torp, Executive Vice President for Communications and User Experience at the Research Council of Norway, and also one of our valued corporate partners here at the Nordic Alliance, who will share new research on social media, trust, and the extent to which people believe in conspiracy theories. We will also hear from distinguished Professor Jeremy Lipschultz from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, who will talk about some of the key themes from his upcoming book on social media ethics and the law. And finally, we have Professor Vilma Luma'ahu from University of Jyväskylä and one of our NORA academic partners, who will present results from a recent international research project on transparency and strategic communication of Russia. With that, over to you, Dennis, for a few words maybe on the NORA EACD partnership and also some housekeeping for today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Alex. My name is Dennis Larsson. I'm on the board at the EACD and also happily involved with NORA. And I'm very thrilled to be co-hosting this event with you and the Nordic Alliance. And thanks also to the Norwegian School of Management for their support today. Today's topic is of real interest, and it's great to see that so many of you have joined us. I think we have about 170 attendees. I've myself lost count of the number of times trust and social media has come up in recent conversations with leaders and communicators in the recent months. And I, for one, certainly look forward to picking up nuggets of wisdom from our excellent panel, research insights that are relevant for members of the audience and practitioners. At the EACD, we're very much committed to sharing essential insights for communicators and professionals alike, and really fostering peer-to-peer conversations, furthering the field of communication. And I'd like to welcome any of you in the audience who are not yet members to consider joining the EACD and check out NORA as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of today's session. First, a couple of words of housekeeping before I hand over to our first speaker. First point is that we are recording today's session, as you may have noticed, for further distribution among NORA members and EACD members. So with that, if you prefer to remain anonymous, if you want to ask a question and remain anonymous, please do mark that in your question. And I'd invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you have a question as you're listening to our panelists. And we'll make sure to pick up as many of these questions as we can at the end. So we'll hear from our panelists first, and then we'll have ample time in the second half of the session today for a good Q&A with the panel, which will be an opportunity to have an interactive discussion. So please do send us your questions through the question function. We might ask a few of you to elaborate on your question and perhaps unmute your microphone and share the question verbally. But we'll see how much time we have and how we go and how many questions we do get in. Okay, so with no further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, who is Katrina Torp. As Alex said, Executive Vice President for Communication and User Experience at the Norwegian Research Council, the Research Council of Norway. Katrina is also one of my colleagues at the EACD, and she's the country representative for Norway. And she's also a founding member, as Alex said, of NORA. So a real good bridge between science and practice. She's a regular speaker on communication issues and a real strong contributor to the field of corporate communication. And in one of my conversations with her, she says she's a self-confessed communication measurement nerd. So Katrina, with that, over to you.
Thank you very much for those very, very kind words, Dennis. It's great to be here today and be able to share with you all some insights. Like Dennis said, I love numbers. So my introduction to today's topic is going to be about what people think and what they've said in surveys that we've been running for years together with Kantar. So I will kind of set the scene and give you some perspectives from Norway. And we've surveyed all the numbers I refer to are based on research of more than 1,000 respondents. So they're quite solid numbers. But I will try not to kill you with numbers, but I will touch upon 3 topics. What sources of information do we trust, and who the sender of the information? Secondly, how big is the issue of untrue fake news in Norway, and which channel fuel them? And then at the end, I will share with you some insights on do Norwegians believe in conspiracy theories. So the first question, what and who we trust? Of course, the Research Council, we're interested in, well, do people believe in research? And the overwhelming answer to that question is yes, they do. And they have done so for years. What's interesting to note about this graph is that the increase of trust in research during the period of the pandemic. And our theory is that the fact that we have been talking so much about research and vaccines and all research-based information has been in the mainstream media has made people more aware of the quality of research. And we've also checked, the figures behind these numbers. So who trusts the research the most? What we can see is that age, gender, etc., doesn't make that much of a difference. Actually, the big differentiator is level of education. And we can see that people with less high education, they are a little bit more uncertain about what kind of information to trust. So you can see that the yellow graph here is a little bit more up and down. And whenever there is a lot of media attention around research, they tend to believe more and they tend to forget more easily. And we also started to ask when the pandemic started, do you think that you personally will benefit from the results of research? Thinking that everyone would say yes, waiting for the vaccine. And as you can see, the numbers are not 100%. So around 70% of people with a university or college degree believe they will benefit personally, whereas people with a lesser degree will believe this to a lesser extent. And we don't really know why, because this is the same for everyone. It should be. So who do we believe? I think that this graph shows that Norwegians are quite reasonable people. They believe the people who are closest to the issue at hand. Here we've asked media statements about corona. Who do you trust? Well, doctors and healthcare personnel, very good. Researchers, very good. Government officials, also a very important point to have the trust in the society that you need to actually reinforce all the measurements we're all going through at the moment. Politicians are also quite high up on the list here in Norway, whereas Norway, as in many other countries, I think journalists, 3 out of 10 believe in them. So we've also looked at this over time, and we can see that it's quite stable over time. And maybe during the pandemic, politicians and journalists have been a little bit more up and down than the other groups, and also government officials. And we think these are linked to the various cycles in the pandemic and handling of it. So how big is the problem of fake news in Norway? We're, of course, exposed to an international media picture, but around 7 out of 10 think they have found information they doubt it was true, and 44% are sure that they have received fake or untrue news. So when we look at, well, where does this news come from? Overwhelmingly, it's the three culprits, so to say, are at the bottom of this graph. That is social media. Those are the sources of information where untrue or fake news occur more often. And all the kind of Aftenposten, etc., and the names that you don't know, that those are established Norwegian editorial medias. So they top the list. and Facebook is on the bottom of the list when it comes to trust. We've also asked people what they think about the COVID-related news, and they're actually half believe that they have received false information about COVID, which is quite high. And again, Facebook is the channel that shares this kind of information more often than any other media channel. But I also thought it was interesting to note that actually editorial online newspapers also, 1 out of 10, find that they sometimes also share unsubstantiated information, which is something to watch out for. And then, as I promised to share some conspiracy theory facts with you, I will share this now. Do people believe in conspiracy theories, and what kind of theories do they believe in? We actually forwarded 5 statements. The first one is more maybe controversial, more than a conspiracy theory, which is around, well, do you think that the government's measure against COVID-19 has been, too overwhelming or too extensive, that it has been too intrusive? And actually very few agrees to this statement, and most people disagree quite strongly. And then when it comes to a more conspiracy-like statement, do you think that the COVID is less dangerous than the government has led us to believe? 8 out of 10 reject that claim completely, and very few agrees to it. And very few also agrees that COVID was produced in a laboratory. But when we ask, and I'm very curious to hear from Jeremy later on, actually in Norway, only 2% agrees to the statement that there was widespread voter fraud in the US. Of course, we're way away from the issue, and 9 out of 10 reject that as an untrue statement. And everyone has an opinion on it. Only 4% say they don't know. Whereas we asked another kind of dubious question around the 5G mobile network. Does it kind of represent a health hazard? And most people reject that as well. But there you have a larger proportion who are unsure about this issue, probably because they never thought about it. So to conclude on this section, I think we can say that Norwegians are generally very skeptical to controversial statements and conspiracy theories. 8 out of 10 say they do not agree with any of them. Women tends to be more skeptical to conspiracy-like statements than men. And again, level of education matters. People with higher education are less certain, without higher education are less certain about what to think than people with more education. And this gives us, from a communication perspective, an important job. So to sum up, the good news for the Norwegian public debate is that research and fact-based information holds a quite strong position. And also that people believe the people who knows the most about the subject at hand, researchers, healthcare people when it comes to COVID. And also the social media channels, people are aware of the danger of untrue or fake news, especially the things that are shared through Facebook. But also I think it's a sign of warning that editorial channels, they struggle with their business model, but they also need to be aware to become, to be sure that they are relevant in the long run and that they are the holder of the truth also going forward. And lastly, Norwegians, they don't believe much in conspiracy theories, at least not the ones that we put before them, and they reject them quite so firmly as a general rule. So with that, I'm happy to hand back to you, Dennis.
Thank you, Katrina. Really interesting findings. Good to get some fresh insight, and especially coming from the Research Council, where trust in research clearly is the forefront of what you do. A lot of questions arise in my mind, and it's good to see some questions coming in from the audience. Please continue to write questions, go to the Q&A button, anything you're interested in, we'll try to pick it up when we get to the Q&A. I'll be interested when we get to the discussion to see what the thinking is around the different panelists, also from the US and the Finnish perspective, around whether some of these findings that you portray here, whether there's a cultural component to this. So perhaps let's hand over to Jeremy Lipschutz, who is the Peter Kiewit Distinguished Professor at the College of Communication and Fine Arts and the Media at the University of Nebraska, joining us all the way from Omaha. Dr. Lipschutz is a regular commentator in all manner of media and has published many books and scholarly articles on media, law, new communication technologies, social media, education. And his latest book, a plug here for you, Jeremy, Social Media Law and Ethics, is due for release this coming June. Jeremy, we're honored to have you. Thanks so much for joining us all the way from Omaha. Please take it away.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm reminded from our early comments that as early as 1955, the field of communication has been studying personal influence, and Katz and Lazarsfeld found very similar findings that indeed people closest to you, people who you view as the most credible sources with the credible messages, are the ones you're going to trust the most. It's really a matter of source and message credibility. So I've been involved in the world of virtual communities since about 1983. This led ultimately to social media communication in 2015. It's now in its third edition, Social Media Measurement and Management, which is about my class, and now Social Media Law and Ethics. It's been an interesting ride since 2004 as my students and I navigate the world of social media influence campaigns. And, you know, it's a world from a law and ethics standpoint that begins with the problem of reputation management. And in the US, that means a lack of a right to be forgotten. So when you Google Justine Sacco, as I did for this presentation, she's still there with the mistake that she made online. Corporate communication has been struggling with this since the dawn of social media in terms of use of paid influencers and lack of transparency and disclosure. And theoretically, you know, in the US, we rely heavily upon the marketplace of ideas, freedom of expression, the First Amendment, and the idea that, as Professor Thomas Emerson suggested, that ultimately we need free expression. The world of ethics, I think, is what I turn to in this new book because law, as you'll see, has its limits, particularly in a rapidly changing technological environment and space. So what are ethics? Ethics really come down to your sense of virtue, your moral principles. And we can find a lot of words that relate to ethics. The problem, of course, is that sometimes those words are in conflict. Truth and privacy, probably a good example. The world of corporate social responsibility, CSR, presents another challenge at the organizational level, which mainly is we say we are socially responsible as an organization. We talk the talk, but do we really walk the walk? And there's variability on that. We live in a social media landscape controlled by a few who have become very wealthy in this space. And congressional investigations have already disclosed that indeed people like Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook believed that it was much easier once you had the money to buy Instagram than to compete with them. So you have concentration of corporate power and antitrust. And then comes our January 6th Capitol siege and the fact that Twitter can literally present a lifetime ban to, at that time, a sitting president for safety reasons. So yeah, it is all about fake news, and it's about who are the purveyors of it, right? The social media landscape in terms of data is fragmented, but if you look at Google/YouTube and Facebook, there is a dominance that we are concerned about. In my part of the world, the Eighth Circuit in the United States, we are starting to see case law in which professional standards are being applied to student and workplace behavior. We have been through a stretch with Instagram influencers. This is the Lord and Taylor case, where it turns out that social media influence campaigns often have involved paid influencers who have not disclosed that they are promoting, for example, this dress that's sold out online. So that's a broad problem in terms of the fact that when we have disclosure of financial interests, they often are buried in the posts. This is, of course, a global internet. That's why we are connecting here this afternoon. And the laws vary from country to country. This is pornography as an example. In this country, social media policies have been examined, and the CBS healthcare case again points to what is a legitimate business interest, what is appropriate behavior in the workplace. And it really comes down to communication that is safe and civil and applies traditional workplace standards. We have some case law at the US Supreme Court level, and the interesting phrase here in Packingham, which was about registered sex offenders, is that we're dealing with what the court called the modern public square. But we're also dealing with Facebook threats, as we had in the Alonis case, and the fact that in this case, at trial, Anthony Alonis' state of mind should have been examined and wasn't if a criminal conviction was going to be upheld for making those kinds of threats. We are in an environment here in the US where, the 50 states are doing a variety of practices through law and regulation because our federal government, as you know, is very polarized and doesn't get a whole lot done. California is closest to what you would know in the European model of GDPR. Copyright intellectual property is another aspect. And in the Naruto case, we found out that, yes, a monkey selfie was in the public domain, but it's not at all clear how far that goes in terms of the creator rights of photographers. We're still working through that. It goes to artists. The Walmart case ended when Walmart protected its trademark through a cease and desist letter, and the artist relented and took this photo down off the internet. We are in a rapidly technologically changing space, and biometrics is kind of the cutting edge of this, such as facial recognition and chatbot technologies. And in Illinois, because they had a biometric law, their Facebook users are getting a small settlement for being tagged without their consent. And ethically, consent is a huge issue. Sometimes ethics also intersect with law when it comes to consent. We know since 1948 that these are human rights issues, to have free expression, free opinion. And we know that there are ongoing issues in terms of the lack of gatekeeping in social media. So, we talk about fake news. The real issue is that the traditional news gatekeepers, and I was a journalist before I became a professor, we did a lot of gatekeeping in the 1980s when I was a broadcast journalist. Those are absent now in this social media space. And so we get in last fall's congressional hearings this interesting exchange from Senator Ted Cruz and Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, in which the New York Post, one of the oldest newspapers in this country, was stopped because they were being forced to remove a tweet. And Dorsey says, hey, remove the tweet and you can have Twitter back. So we have given the power over gatekeeping to Twitter and Facebook and Google. So most recently, the US Supreme Court, in a case involving former President Trump's right or lack of right to block users, said this: it seems rather odd to say that something is a government forum when a private company has unrestricted authority to do away with it. The disparity between Twitter's control and Twitter's ability to bar Trump not only from interacting with a few users, but everybody, is a stark contrast. Most recently, this week, Facebook is responding that their response to misinformation is self-regulation through the use of tiny labeling. So it does go to this question of, do we need more help as users to be protected from disinformation and misinformation? Do we need better media literacy skills? Education was mentioned, or both? And probably I'm answering, I think, my own question. So it really comes back to source and message credibility, how personal influence plays out in social media channels, the lack of trust, the lack of gatekeeping, Facebook control, as well as other social media channels. And something that I didn't think about until the first presentation, which is that we study social networks in the UNO Social Media Lab. And what Mark Smith and his colleagues published on Pew Internet back in 2014 still holds that, at least in this country, we're dealing with highly polarized crowds. There's a Republican view, a red view, and a Democrat view, a blue view, and they don't interact with each other much. So it leaves the landscape of social media quite open for the problem you present here, fake news.
Thank you, Jeremy. A lot to think about there, and look forward again to the discussion. We're getting some questions coming in. Reminder, keep the questions coming, and we'll pick up in the conversation piece. Very interesting to explore this in more detail, and really keen to understand also from a corporate communication perspective. You talk very succinctly about the law and the changing role of gatekeepers. I'm sure our audience down the line would be interested in learning a little bit. What can companies do? I mean, seeing that, given, if you believe the Edelman Trust Barometer data, there's an increasing trust, still a little bit lagging, but an increasing trust role also for corporations, brands that you trust to then have a voice on societal issues and social change. So very much look forward to the conversation. I'd like to move now to our last speaker, who joins us from Finland, Vilma Luma'ahu, who is Professor of Corporate Communication at the School of Business and Economics at the University of Jyväskylä. Vilma is a member of NORA, a part of the research group at the Nordic Alliance. And her consultative work for leaders and organizations really shows a very strong commitment to bridging scientific research into practice. She's an avid researcher, won many awards. And I had a quick look, Vilma, at your publications list, recent publications, which is longer than my arm. So very much look forward to hearing your perspective here from latest research. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dennis. A very good evening to those of you who are having an evening, and at least good morning to you, Jeremy. And speaking to you from Jyväskylä, where we still have snow, unfortunately. It's April, I know. It's kind of depressing. But I'm talking to you today about influence mechanisms, and this is part of a project that was funded by the government here in Finland, and it yielded up in a publication that I'm kind of citing here, which is Strategic Communications in Russia, Public Relations and Advertising. So in our research, we first of all looked at how do Russian scholars define strategic communication so that we can understand what do they mean when they're talking about that. And let's see if I can move my show on. All right, so let's start with how do they view strategic communication? Well, first of all, it's a set of actions, and the aim is to form and transform some idea into minds of a target audience. And that could be anything from public diplomacy, public relations, or whatever we call information operations. It can be positive, negative, manipulated, disinformation, including or propaganda. But strategic communications, it's just a tool in the sense that there is an attempt to change somebody's mind about something. Now, when we looked at this literature and when we interviewed scholars from Russia, because that was our interest, especially here in Finland, our neighboring country, what specific things came up where there's always a particular target audience. So in the strategic communication of Russia, it's often targeted. It's strategically coordinated, though it doesn't always look that way. there is always an attempt to impact something. So make a change or move something or change the way people view it. And there is a strategy behind it. And the communication is understood to be a very influential tool for this with the help of information technologies. And when we think about strategic communication, we often think about it, okay, well, it's in business, or then it's information warfare or something very extreme. But actually, in our study, we found that it's actually used in politics, geopolitics, business, industry, society, and even culture. So strategic communication has a lot of functions. But one central concept that we ran into, and a phenomena that many of you are actually facing as well, is strategic ambiguity. So strategic ambiguity is where you are on purpose unclear. This is what you do with your kids when you're telling the other one how many candies the other one got. So you give a vague number of something because you don't want to make them argue. And this is a very central tactic that's even today used in when it comes to all kinds of strategic influence, even on the level of nation states. So you omit important contextual cues and enable multiple different interpretations, for example, for that. But let's look at what our findings were. So we made up this grid because we were trying to understand how does this communication work. So the grid is between transparent communication and non-transparent communication, as well as strategic communication and non-strategic. Because one of our questions was, well, is all of this strategic? Is all these influence mechanisms, are they always sure of who is their target audience and who are they attempting to act on, and you know, what's their impact, and are they really thought through? And we found that it's actually all different forms exist. So it's not only the official statements and speeches that we think are the most strategic and most transparent ways, but there's also strategically sent out rumors, stories, reactions, comments, propaganda, and information warfare. And based on all of these, we did a very simplistic comparison of how to understand the information attempts and strategic communication of Russia. So we're comparing our Western understanding of communication, and with that said, it's mostly the Western democratic way of seeing things, and that mostly the Scandinavian or the Anglo-Saxon way of understanding it, and compare it with Russian context. And that said, these are extremes, so realities may fall somewhere in between. But the biggest differences I've highlighted here, they are in the logic, for example. So when you think about the Western authorities or our communication that we have in society, it's mostly by authorities to serve citizen needs. And if it doesn't serve citizen needs, there's complaints. But when you look at Russian communication, it's actually just one of the needs could be the citizen needs. There's often many other needs, such as party needs, political needs, economical needs, stability needs, something like that. So the aim of this communication, the logic behind this, serves several purposes. The order of things, and this is something that's very simple to do, that we in the West often miss. We think the most important message is at the beginning and very easy to find, but actually in the Russian context, the most important message is said after the comma, and you really have to search for it. So it's not obvious what the real message is. When you look at the audience, we usually target our communication and we, separate between internal and external. But in the Russian case, in our study, most external messages have to actually resonate with internal public. So whatever Russia says, it's also a message for the Russian citizens. And that explains why they emphasize the things that we wouldn't emphasize. When we look at auto communication, this is something that's optional for external messages, but actually this is central for the central, not just for the Russian audiences, but also for the external messages that they send. And source, we think in the West often that source is more important than who says it. But actually, in the Russian context, the authority or source is just as important as the message itself. And context, with us, it plays a supportive role in the West, but actually in the Russian context and presentation may often define the whole message. So the content may change depending on in which context it's said. And then an interesting thing that they're doing that we don't use that much is probing, meaning that there is a message tested by some lower level politician before the real message comes through, and just to test how the people feel about it. And kind of like a human lab of testing things on society in real time before the real decision is made. And threats, we think, well, basically there is a low context where messages, direct and clear, and there's minimal analysis necessary. Usually our messages are pretty clear, but actually the Russian context is a very high context message environment, where there's deep analysis required, and you will find several different levels of meaning and different layers. Well, with us, we think transparency has intrinsic value in our society, but actually in the Russian context, transparency is a tool and non-transparency is where the power is. So if you're able to know something and you don't disclose what you know, that's power. And strategic messages, we think, should be communicated clearly, but actually strategic ambiguity is a central tool when it comes to influence strategies in the Russian context. So pretty quick, so we can start discussion and hear your opinions and comments.
Thanks, Vilma. Great. So we've got a lot of good input from various angles here. We've covered the US, we had the Norwegian view, and we have your view comparing Russia to the entire West. So there's a lot to tap into there. I'll kick us off picking up a couple of questions that I saw coming through. Please, if you're in the audience, now's the time, add any questions you might have, get involved in the discussion. First question I'd like to ask is related to COVID and the pharma industry. So the question is, how should the pharma industry rebuild trust, given the current recognition of the importance of medicine in the current climate? And I imagine if we think about the comparisons that historically have been made between pharma's reputation, even sort of aligned to the tobacco industry reputation, and pharma has traditionally had a pretty bad reputation. Any tips from any of the panelists around, if you're a pharma communicator, what can you do now to ride that wave, as we saw some of that from at least the Norwegian angle from Katrina's research around actually the Norwegian public seems to be pretty trusting of especially the official governmental communicators, maybe less of the journalists or less of the politicians. But when it comes to COVID-19, what are the implications then if you're a pharma company, if you're trying to convince people to take the vaccine and broader building on that trust to really rebuild, if you can say that, trust in the pharma industry? Katrina, do you want to have a first stab at that?
Yes, of course, I don't have numbers related especially to the pharma industry. What I do have is number related to who do you trust, research funded by private companies or by official bodies. And of course, government-funded research has a higher credibility, but still the credibility of privately funded research is very high. So I think that is something, and being open on the issues, being open. I think transparency works better at least in Norway, Vilma, than in Russia, and being open on all the different aspects and the things that you don't know, I think is probably the best way forward.
Great, thanks, Katrina. Vilma, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, sure. So we've done some research on reputation and trust, and we find that there's actually a sector reputation or a sector trust level that you really can't easily change. And so if you're fighting against something that is the common trend, the only thing you can actually do is just make your citizens and your customers' experiences as positive as possible, so that they can kind of share from their personal experience. But that's still limited in the sense. I wouldn't recommend partnering up with those who are trusted. Not necessarily. That doesn't always help, because then you can easily be called out on trying to improve your trust. So I would just say, keep up the good work and just pick your battles, in the sense that make sure that the good message is also heard. But changing trust is a very slow process.
Okay,
Alex mentioned earlier the Edelman Trust Barometer data, and that has suggested that around the world there is an expectation that CEOs step up and be leaders of communication, of truthful, honest communication. We, of course, in the US, for the first year of this pandemic, had the problem that the president of the United States at the time was a leader in fake news. He said a lot of things that were not true. Journalists tried to correct, but it was a very noisy environment in places like Twitter. And Twitter let him do that for about a year, saying a lot of things that just didn't add up to the facts. So when you have half a country supporting a political leader and trusting everything he says, because there's a lack of critical thinking skills there, it becomes, as you say, very difficult to sort of turn the tide and say, these things really aren't true.
Exactly. Following on that, a question for you, Dr. Lipschutz. What kind of public conversations are you having in the States about the influence big tech companies have in politics? So how much focus is put on the fact that outside of these companies, people who make policies have no knowledge on how platforms operate when you're talking about gatekeeping in social media? A good question there from Virva.
Yeah, I think that there is increased scrutiny in this country, starting with the congressional hearings that were held in the fall. And there's actually, I think, support on both sides of the political aisle for some increased monitoring regulation. I think the challenge is, and I mentioned I came out of life as a radio journalist in the 1980s. The challenge is that broadcast regulation model that we tried really didn't work very well. It was sort of a sham, to be honest. It was, it gave the broadcasters a lot of autonomy, but the scheme sort of looked like the government was keeping an eye on it. So I'm not entirely convinced that regulation works all that well. And I would like to see more emphasis on the user side of better understanding, better education. Education was mentioned earlier. The more that social media users are educated about how this whole thing works, I think the better off we're all going to be.
Exactly. I want to come back to Katrina in a second, a specific question on your research, and also back to Vilma on the implications of your findings for leaders in comms of multinationals that are aiming to communicate both in Russia and in the West. But maybe while we have you, Jeremy, just a quick follow-up question. I was struck by your research and the conversation about gatekeepers and how difficult it is to, as you just said, also to cut through this increasingly polarized, both politically polarized and the whole bubble effect and so on, cutting through the divide and reaching diverse audiences who are so different in their perceptions, as some of Katrina's research pointed to. So my question would be, what would your advice be to corporations that are trying to really position themselves as, say, thought leaders on specific societal topics? Should they go to social media first? Should it be part of a orchestrated further strategy across all channels? What's the role for corporates, big brands, in furthering their social purpose messages on societal topics? I mean, we saw Me Too, we saw Black Lives Matter. Should everyone jump on that bandwagon? Every brand have something to say? Or what's your advice on those big topics that come up in society and the role of companies positioning themselves on social media?
I'm a big believer in authentic conversation and long-term relationship building, whether it be through computer-mediated communication or face-to-face. And the social media lab that I lead spends a lot of time working with rural Nebraska communities. And, during the pandemic, they have higher percentages of people who didn't want to wear masks, who didn't want to socially distance, and who now don't want to take the vaccine. So, I think what we've learned from all of this is that at the corporate level, you've got to really get boots on the ground. You've got to get out there in the community. In this country, in the middle of the US, we're sometimes seen as flyover country between California and New York. We got to get corporate leaders on the ground throughout the population to meet with local leaders, because we know from the trust data that it's at the local level people are more likely to trust the messages. So I think it's got to be that personal influence, not only two-step, but multi-step flow of communication and influence.
Great, exactly. So they have to see the tangible evidence. They have to see real leadership on the ground, not just scattergun large campaigns. Great advice. Thank you, Jeremy. Turning to Katrina, a question came in from Mirko saying they were surprised to see that trust with journalists is low, but high with credible channels, like the big news outlets that are credible here in Norway, at least. The question is trust in media in general eroding due to quantity of untrue facts in social media? So that kind of overlay effect, or generalizing the profession of editors and journalists?
Well, honestly, that's a question I don't dare to ask because I don't have sufficient numbers to be able to answer that correctly. So it would be speculation from my side. But I think it was interesting in some of the questions we've asked now, that where we can see that also editorial media are being perceived to broadcast fake or untrue news, which is not a good position for them to be in. And I think that they are struggling with their business models, of course, because people are not willing to pay for proper journalism, investigative journalism, but they are also dependent on having that trust. Otherwise, what else should they base their future on? So I think it's a numbers that I'm sure media outlets are following quite closely, and they should.
And Jeremy, in the States, is the pendulum shifting in some degree, or is it only among some segments where you see people are willing to pay a little bit more for quality content and really go to sources they can trust, that they know are credible?
I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, the New York Times was particularly successful with its paywall. The Washington Post, not quite so much. Local newspapers, my local newspaper here in Omaha, which used to be an employee-owned newspaper and then was purchased by Berkshire Hathaway and Warren Buffett and then spun off. It's struggled a lot. There have been a lot of layoffs, so staff sizes are down. You know, even at big major dailies like the Chicago Tribune, they've emphasized investigative journalism, but the editors, there are fewer editors, there are fewer specialists, and I think it's a real struggle because, and partly because of social media, that we can get so much information online that they have to compete, and they weren't really ready to compete when this all hit. No. So I think it's a tough road, but I do think that there are some really interesting models emerging in terms of nonprofit journalism, taking it out of the profit sector, having basically a foundation support investigative journalism. That is working in some places.
Yeah, I think the Guardian in the UK has done quite well in that regard. Katrina, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a short comment on one of the things Jeremy said about local newspapers, because actually they are holding a quite strong position also in Norway, and they have started also to collaborate to kind of fend off some of the business model issues, but they are quite strong, I think, without remember exactly the numbers, but I think they're holding their basis quite well here as well.
Thanks for that. Okay, I want to come back briefly to the topic of education, but first turning to Russia again. Vilma, I was really struck by your research, how different the view is compared to Russia and the West in terms of your findings. And one thing that stuck with me was the point of transparency, where it was almost seen, if I remember correctly, as a value from Russian-based communication to not be transparent. If I got that right, compared to the West. So what would you say communicators that have to communicate, so say big global companies that are communicating to Russian audiences and to Western audiences, where when I speak to corporate communication leaders, the trend seems to be to find at least some common denominators across their approach to communication. And one of the things that often comes up in the common denominators is, let's be more open, let's be more transparent. How would you advise them to approach a market like Russia, where, if I got that right, the approach actually merits a real recalibration for that particular market?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, Dennis. And that said, I'm not that good an expert on Russia, so we just look at the strategic communication. So my advice comes from merely our research. But I would think, actually, you always have to start with the stakeholder, the individual you're trying to reach. And with that in mind, when there's a Western originating corporation in Russia communicating, they don't put them into the same category as Russian organizations. So it's not exactly that you have to match everything that's going on, or that's the trend there. You just have to see where your corporation has a say or a play in that individual's life, and what kind of questions are unanswered. And in some areas of the world, it's actually quite dangerous to start this, try to fit in, because many of the practices would be considered illegal or unethical in other parts where you are. And it's a problematic area. And I think to start with, you have to educate your employees of these differences, because they will be constantly pressured between these two environments and dealing with this kind of struggle. But that said, I think it merits, Russian audiences and publics, they do also, some of them, they follow also other outlets. So it really depends on the stakeholder who you're trying to reach and what their needs are.
Got it. No size fits all, as becoming abundantly clear from all of your positions here and all of your research. So thanks for that, Vilma. I'll hand over to Alex in a second to ask a final question and then close off proceedings today for today. Before I do that, just a quick final word from any of you on the role of education. Now, we saw from Katrina's research the big difference between those that are perhaps more higher educated and their trust in media and in general. And so a question came in about, how do we educate common users, whether they are educated or not, to distinguish between reliable and fake news? What's the role of education? And as I was thinking about this, I was minded of my kids who are 9 and 10, and at school they already now, they grow up in an age of digital and social media. They learn how to be very critical, how to triangulate between different sources, and because they have access. And so I guess it starts at school. But how do we build in this good knowledge about how to distinguish between real and fake news, and how to play that game in a way that makes sense? Anyone on the panel who wish to comment on that?
Well, I could start. I think, as with all education, you have to motivate the individual to ask who's behind something and start looking at it more critically, because our automatic reaction is always just to believe or just to go with it. And just to stop that automatic thinking from happening, that's already a quick start, and that's already a good beginning. So that's where you start.
Good point. Absolutely. Okay, Katrina, Jeremy, anything to add there?
Well, we're the Research Council. We also are running some programs for young people where we try to encourage them into using research methods. Because if you start to thinking hypothesis, checking out, verification, the whole process can be taught to small children, because it's just a way of thinking. And if you manage to get that into young people, I think it will be very helpful, and you don't need a PhD to understand that.
Absolutely.
Media literacy is really deconstruction of the social construction of reality. And so we need, at the curriculum level, more emphasis on this. I've been pitching this for over 20 years in the States, that it's as important as reading, writing, and arithmetic to be able to consume media, because we are absorbed by it. In the end, I kind of return to my radio engineering roots and say that, there's such a thing as signal to noise ratio. And what we've been dealing with in this problem is a lot of noise and difficulty getting the signal through a lot of noise. And so we've got to lower the level of noise and raise the signal for those signals to become clear. Not necessarily gatekeeping, not necessarily blocking information, but emphasizing information that has accuracy and integrity.
Yep, very good way of putting it. And with that, the role of language that cuts through the divide and cuts through the noise as well is essential. I'm really enthused by this entire conversation. I certainly learned a lot. I'm sure our audience members have as well. And on that point of education, that's truly in the mission of both the EACD and NORA, bridging science to practice, making sure communicators and leaders are continuously learning and educating themselves on the best way ethically and properly to communicate things that matter to societies. So with that, thank you for your interest. I'm going to hand over to Alex to close proceedings today.
Yes, thank you very much, Dennis. Since we still have 4 minutes, I'd like to finish also with one additional question that I have here that kind of ties, I think, very well, ties up what you've discussed last about credibility and who's the source, who's the actor behind information, back to something that actually Katrina mentioned right in the beginning based on her data on trust in public media versus Facebook and Twitter and so on. And there, it was quite delighting to see that Twitter and Facebook and so on were so low. I think it was slide 10 or so versus these other public media outlets. The question that arises though is do we have to pour some water into the wine here? Is that really the trust in Facebook? Who's the agent? How are these questions asked? And isn't there an issue also of sort of a multi-layered nature of trust and credibility? Maybe also Jeremy can comment on that, how to assess that, because when we ask about trust in Facebook, that's one thing, but isn't it really about the trust in the information we see on Facebook, and then also the trust in agents like you mentioned, relatives of trusted parties around us, fake accounts, and so on. So that was just to tie that up. Maybe a comment from you.
Sorry, Dream. Go on.
I was just going to add that the silver lining of the Trump fake news crisis has been that it's really informed us and continues to inform us. So, Donald Trump's answer to being banned for life on Twitter is, I'm going to start my own social network. I have an email list of my strongest supporters. So we still have people still have means to exercise communication with people who are like-minded. So, I think we're going to continue to have this polarization problem. Is the bottom.
I think that I can see on the chat as well, there is a very specific questions about two of the graphs that I showed, because they seem to be contradictory, but I went through them quite fast. The first question where we asked, who do you believe the most as a sender of information about COVID? So their politicians and health professionals, etc., was scoring higher than journalists, but it's not natural for a journalist to take that role. And when I showed the other graph of who are the channels that you trust the most, all the big media outlets in Norway came on top and social media on the bottom. So I think it's a framing of the question that makes that an apparent contradiction.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And with that, we are almost out of time. I would just want to extend a big thank you to all our panelists. A big thank you also to our corporate partners who support our work here at NORA. And also a thank you to you, Dennis. I've seen this comment a couple of times, actually, that people really liked your moderation and your leading of the discussion. And I fully want to second that. You did a great job, I think, in tying up these different perspectives through the hour. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Reminder here to just follow our social media of the Nordic Alliance, but also EACD to see upcoming events. We'll post a video recording of this webinar, and we hope to see you all in one of our future events to join us and our discussions here. So bye-bye.